Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Jack White, titled Lazaretto. Now it'd be hard to argue that the White Stripes weren't one of the most essential rock acts of the 21st century thus far. It'd be even harder to argue that at least 4 of their albums weren't bona fide classics by doing what most rock bands should be doing, stripping down to the basics, writing gripping melody lines, and then building back on top of it thanks to the virtuoso songwriting talents of Jack White. But one thing was all the more certain. Ever since the breakup of the White Stripes, hell, probably even since before then, Jack White has been obsessed with his place with respect to the women in his life. First with his breakup from his partner in the White Stripes, Meg White, and then his divorce from Karen Elson. You can tell these events have haunted him for years, and nowhere did this become more apparent than on his 2012 solo album, Blunderbuss. And make no mistake, for the most part, that album brought everything that I loved about the White Stripes to the forefront on that record. And on a musical level, I dug the hell out of it. The guitar work was solid, I liked the genre-hopping nature of the tunes between garage, blues, and folk, and the melodic compositions were as good as ever. Lyrically, though, Jack White was kind of playing in a bit of a gray zone with his framing that was kind of tricky to gauge. While he was more often playing the evil woman card, probably more than he should have, Jack White made it very clear that he wasn't exactly a sympathetic character that we should identify with, and that his damaged views on what love should be, all characterized by the female backing vocals that supported him, that really add a certain level of nuance to the record that I think some people overlooked. But at the same time, there's something to a limit of how much of that particular brand of blues rock inspired topic in terms of the evil woman thing that I can reasonably stomach. So when I heard reports suggesting that White was going back to this particular vein, I was a little less enthused about this record than I'd like to be. Even if there was signs of more country instrumentation. As the country music critic on YouTube, I was enthused about that. So on that uncertain note, I checked out Lazaretto. How'd it turn out? Well, I'm a little perplexed with this one because I keep getting the frustrating feeling that this album should be gripping me more, and I mean a lot more. I mean, a rock record rooted in blues and country, with great instrumental texture and production, with a wide breadth of instrumentation, written and performed by a songwriter with a natural gift for great melody and witty lyrics and fantastic framing. This is just a pile of stuff I really love. So why don't I love Lazaretto by Jack White? It's his most lavish, his most polished, and by all accounts as complex, if not more of a record than Blunderbuss. So what's not clicking with me here? Because, you know what, at first look, it all should work. Jack White, as a singer, does take a little bit of time to get used to, but he's vicious and has a ton of energy and emotional range, and he throws himself into every song he touches. And yet, while his voice does seem better fit for the scratchy, lo-fi, borderline gothic rock instrumentation, he's surprisingly competent in the more melodic realm of country music, better than I was expecting. In fact, this album might have his most melodic, reserved, composed performance to date, which, you know what, isn't a bad thing, especially because it adds a certain amount of world weariness to his more country songs that does feel cohesive. It does kind of work for him. And you know what, as I said, the instrumentation and production are more lavish and expansive than ever. You have the bluesy garage rock full of spiky guitar leads, quietly echoing and well-textured percussion, ominous piano, and beautifully composed organ lines in songs like 3 Women, Lazaretto, Would You Fight For My Love, Highball Stepper, and That Black Bat Licorice. And these are songs that are most familiar to Jack White and his audience, with those gothic symphonic backing vocals and a seedy darkness that underscores every single crackle of the guitar. And yet, in stark contrast to that, you have the country flavored inspired tracks in songs like Temporary Ground, Alone in My Home, and Entitlement. Smooth tones, a lot of steel guitar, and slightly more spacious production to give the richer tones a little bit more room to breathe. And then you've got songs like Just One More Drink, and I Think I Found the Culprit, that fit somewhere in between the middle of these two subgenres. And honestly, it's a great fusion that works pretty well, especially on the latter, cutting into that dangerous minor key saturated sound that permeates the perfect fusion between blues and outlaw country. It just works for me here. Now, the big common element that I think ties them all together is the fiddles, and really, they're the big highlight of this record. Jagged and yet drifting from tone to tone, it It adds a ton of real cohesion and a lot of solid groove to this record. I dug that. And as always, Jack White is a great melodic composer, and the crackling, interweaving melodies and solos show the same tight professionalism that has always defined Jack White's career. And with the exception of the piano ballad Want and Able, which might have some decent poetry, we'll come back to this, but falls flat with the unnecessary binaural vocal production and a really basic melody, the instrumentation is really quite solid on this album. Nervous yet composed, reckless yet still deadly focused and very carefully refined. So okay, where's the problem here? Well, now the obvious answer would be in the songwriting, but at first glance this doesn't seem to be an issue because the Evil Woman card is played substantially less. Thankfully, it's a cliche that's been toned back, as Jack White has described some of these songs that he's written as reworked versions of poetry in plays that he wrote when he was 19 and recently discovered in one of his attics. And when you scan through the lyrics at first glance, you can kinda tell. Thematically, this record seems to be exploring a frustrated state of purgatory, either in love, in heartbreak, or in White's perception of the world. That's very something that a young Jack White could very much relate to. Take the title track. A Lazaretto is a quarantine station for immigrants infected with disease, and when Jack White fuses it with self-aware bragging about his faults, you can tell that that complex framing that Jack White has always brought to the table is back in full. But if it's that sense of purgatory being isolated in the middle that crops up again and again throughout this record. The opening track has him caught between three women that he really can't decide on, but yet he can only describe by their color, and if he says anything more about them, where they work, he'll lose all three of them. At Temporary Ground and Alone in My Home focus on these feelings of isolation and frustration, the latter of which curdles forth even more in probably the best track on the album, Would You Fight for My Love, and In Just One Drink, as he feels like a ghost caught between loving a woman who neglects her love for him in return. And that frustration drives forward tracks like Black Bat Licorice, and I Think We Found the Culprit, the former featuring some of the most descriptive lyrics that Jack White has ever put on his records, as he finally reaches that breaking point that he wants to say all that venom. And it's really that dichotomy between desires and reality that underscores this entire album. Even the more socially conscious track Entitlement, which features really the great double standard of how parents of, say, my generation did so much to define those wants and telling us that we were special and that we could have the world, and then subsequently criticize that generation when they started asking for it and felt entitled to it, which is a conflict that Jack White makes very literal, unfortunately, on the parable like Want and Able, which is another reason that song really doesn't work. It's too broad. Jack White didn't need to hammer down on that theme. But putting that aside, that's not a big enough issue. Where's the real problem here? Well, going a little deeper, I'd argue it comes down to the songwriting and the sense of conflict, because that sense of conflict isn't really defined. Now, some of you are inevitably thinking, wait, he just spent the entire last paragraph describing conflicts, and I definitely did. But note that for the majority of these tracks, nothing really happens. Jack White stews in frustration and indecision, feeling cut out and isolated, and he's smart enough to frame himself as likely being quite deserving of those positions, but there's no climax. There's no change in the stakes. There's never really a moment where Jack White cuts loose and actually does something. Things happen to him. He doesn't make things happen to other people, but he's always a passive player in these songwriting. And because of that, the sense of drama on this record, the sense of that there's emotional stakes here, feels really quite muted. And while that curdled frustration might be a better fit for the goth-inspired blues rock, which are the better songs on this album, it's not as great of a fit for the country instrumentation, as the more placid and slightly subdued instrumentals and Jack White's slightly less ragged and passionate vocals leach away even more of the drama, and the tracks don't have that sense of emotion behind them. And since the songwriting on those tracks isn't nearly as colorful and descriptive, they just seem to have a lot less spark to me. You know what? Look, this album is far from bad. In fact, as I said, it does a lot right between the solid melodies, great arrangements, excellent framing, good delivery, and cohesive lyrics. It's no surprise that this record is doing so well as it is with critics and the audience alike, but it isn't really clicking with me. And I get the feeling it's because there's a lot of frustration and hesitation on this album, but a very, very muted payoff, and that just bugs me on some level. So you know what, for me, it's a 7 out of 10, but guess what? It's still a recommendation, because keep in mind this album is still very much worth your time if you can get sucked into the grooves, and at some points, I really could. You know what, it didn't click for me, but I know good music when I hear it, and it'll probably click well for you. So you know what? Go check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.